Nobody was ready for what happened next. One moment, the internet was already on edge, arguing, dissecting clips, choosing sides. The next, everything detonated at once. A single conversation. A single question. And suddenly, one of the biggest media figures on the planet was staring straight across the table at one of the most polarizing voices in politics, and the tension was so thick you could feel it through the screen. Because when Joe Rogan finally addressed Candace Owens over the Charlie Kirk widow controversy, it didn't sound like a debate. It sounded like a reckoning. No soft introductions. No friendly build-up. Just pressure. The kind that forces people to either clarify their words or collapse under them. Viewers noticed it instantly. Candace's tone shifted. Joe's questions sharpened. And the internet lost its mind. Clips began circulating within minutes. Pauses slowed down. Facial expressions zoomed in. Every word paused like evidence. Supporters called it long overdue accountability. Critics called it an ambush. Neutral viewers just stared, stunned, as one sentence after another seemed to open doors Candace hadn't planned to walk through publicly. And then came the moment that changed everything. A brief hesitation. A carefully chosen answer. And a reaction from Joe that made it clear this wasn't just another viral interview. This was about responsibility, influence, and what happens when public commentary collides with grief, silence, and a story that refuses to settle. Twitter erupted. YouTube went into overdrive. Conservative media split down the middle. And while everyone argued about who won, one thing became undeniable: this conversation had shifted the entire narrative. Because after that exchange, nothing felt controlled anymore. And the fallout was only just beginning. The moment that interview went live, everything people thought they understood about this situation started collapsing in real time. Joe Rogan didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult Candace Owens. He didn't accuse her outright. That was the most unsettling part. He did something far more dangerous. He let her talk, and then he held her words up against each other like evidence under harsh light. From the very start, Joe made it clear this wasn't about politics. It wasn't about ideology. It was about influence, timing, and consequences. He brought up the exact moment Candace first hinted at the Charlie Kirk widow drama, not vaguely, but precisely. Dates. Platforms. Language. He repeated her own phrases back to her, slowly, deliberately, stripping them of the ambiguity that had protected her online. Candace tried to frame it as concern. As curiosity. As someone asking questions out loud that others were too afraid to ask. But Joe didn't let that framing stand unchallenged. He pointed out how her questions landed like conclusions. How her tone suggested inside knowledge. How her audience didn't hear speculation, they heard implication. And once implication spreads at that scale, it doesn't stay theoretical. It becomes narrative. That's when the atmosphere shifted. Candace's confidence tightened. Her posture stiffened. She started choosing words more carefully, pausing longer than usual. Joe leaned forward and asked the question that detonated the first real shockwave. If you didn't know for sure, why speak as if you did? The internet clocked it immediately. That half-second delay before she answered. That breath she took that sounded like calculation, not certainty. Reaction accounts were already clipping it before she finished her sentence. Candace said she trusted her sources. Joe didn't let that pass. He asked who those sources were. Not names, but proximity. Were they first-hand? Were they grieving? Were they directly involved? That's when Candace made her first mistake. She said the word close. Joe seized on it. Close to who? Close in what way? And suddenly, the safe distance she'd maintained online vanished. Because close implies access. Access implies responsibility. And responsibility is exactly what Joe was circling. Behind the scenes, viewers started realizing this wasn't a casual conversation. Joe had done his homework. He referenced deleted posts, streams that were walked back, clarifications that clarified nothing. He laid them out not as accusations, but as contradictions. And the more he did, the more Candace's usual rhythm broke down. She tried to pivot, arguing that silence can be just as harmful as speaking. Joe didn't disagree. He narrowed it further. Silence from whom? And silence about what? Because the person who had stayed completely silent through all of this wasn't Candace. It was the widow. And Joe made it clear how dangerous it is when someone with a massive platform fills a vacuum that doesn't belong to them. That line hit hard. You could feel it land. Candace pushed back, saying the public had a right to ask questions. Joe responded with something that lit the comments on fire. Asking questions is different from shaping suspicion. That sentence alone spawned thousands of posts within minutes. Then Joe brought up the messages. Not leaked documents, not screenshots on screen, but the fact that multiple people had come forward claiming Candace referenced private communications she shouldn't have known about. Candace denied seeing anything directly. Joe didn't accuse her of lying. He asked how she could describe emotional reactions so specifically without seeing or hearing them from the source. That's when Candace's voice dropped. She said she was told things. Joe pressed. Told by whom? She said she couldn't say. And with that, the room changed completely. Because the moment you claim knowledge you won't source, the audience fills in the blanks themselves. Joe said something that stunned even his own listeners. He said that when stories like this break, they don't just hurt reputations, they rewire grief. They turn private loss into public trial. And he asked Candace whether she was prepared to own that outcome. She didn't answer immediately. And that silence was louder than anything else said in the first half of the interview. That's where the clip cuts. That's where the internet started screaming. And that's where the story stopped being about what Candace said, and started becoming about what she was afraid to say next. The tension didn't ease after that pause. It thickened. Joe didn't rush to fill the silence, because he understood exactly what was happening in that moment. Candace wasn't weighing an answer. She was weighing consequences. And the audience could feel it. The comment sections weren't just moving fast anymore, they were panicking, because everyone sensed the conversation had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. Joe finally broke the quiet, but instead of pressing harder, he shifted angles. He asked Candace whether she believed she had been careful enough with her words, knowing how volatile the situation already was. She pushed back, saying the real issue was that people didn't want uncomfortable truths discussed. Joe nodded, then dismantled that argument in one sentence. He said uncomfortable truths still require accuracy, especially when the people affected aren't in the room to defend themselves. That's when Candace's composure started to visibly crack. Not dramatically, not explosively, but subtly. Her sentences became shorter. Her explanations circled instead of landing. Joe noticed and zeroed in. He asked if she'd spoken directly to Charlie's widow before going public. Candace hesitated again. This time longer. Long enough that even her supporters in the live chat started typing, "Answer the question." She finally said no. That answer detonated. Joe didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her of malice. He simply asked why someone would go public with implications about a marriage, a death, and alleged hidden information, without first giving the most affected Joe paused. Then he asked if she thought someone else benefited from the chaos. That's when Candace went quiet again. Her eyes dropped to the table. Her shoulders tensed. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said there are people who know more than she does, and they're not talking. That line rippled outward like a shockwave. Reaction channels immediately reframed their thumbnails. Commentators stopped debating Candace's credibility, and started asking who else was involved. Joe didn't speculate. He didn't name names. He said something even more alarming. When stories fracture like this, it usually means the truth is being fragmented on purpose. Candace looked up sharply at that. For the first time, she didn't argue. She nodded. Joe asked one final question before the segment ended, and it's the one that changed everything. He asked whether Candace believed there was information being deliberately withheld from the public. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "There are things people aren't ready to hear." The clip ended there. Within minutes, social media erupted into full-scale chaos. Some accused Candace of backpedaling. Others claimed Joe had exposed a coordinated narrative. Others insisted the widow's silence was now impossible to ignore. Hashtags trended globally. Clips were slowed down, zoomed in, analyzed frame by frame. Every pause became evidence. Every breath became a theory. And looming over all of it was one terrifying realization that no one could shake. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because if Candace wasn't the source, and Joe wasn't the instigator, then someone else was controlling the flow of information from the shadows. And whoever that was, hadn't spoken yet. By the time the final segment of that conversation circulated, the damage was already irreversible. The story had escaped the studio, outgrown the interview, and turned into something far bigger than either Joe Rogan or Candace Owens could control. This was no longer about who spoke out first. It was about why so many people were suddenly afraid to speak at all. Within hours, prominent voices who had loudly defended Candace just days earlier went quiet. Not with explanations. Not with clarifications. With silence. Tweets vanished. Scheduled live streams were postponed. Comment sections were locked. And to the internet, that kind of coordinated stillness didn't feel accidental. It felt reactive. Joe addressed the fallout on a follow-up episode without naming names, but his tone was noticeably different. More cautious. More measured. He said that when conversations trigger sudden silence across multiple platforms, it usually means people are reassessing what they thought was safe to say. That line alone ignited another wave of speculation, because it suggested that the interview had crossed an invisible boundary. Candace, meanwhile, didn't do what everyone expected. She didn't double down. She didn't launch a rebuttal video. She didn't flood her feed with explanations. Instead, she posted one brief message that sent chills through every corner of the internet. Context matters. And so does timing. Nothing else. No comments. No follow-up. That message became the new obsession. Was it regret? A warning? Or an acknowledgement that she'd said more than she intended? Analysts tore it apart word by word. Some argued it was an attempt to regain control. Others believed it was the closest thing to an admission she could safely offer. And still, the person at the center of the storm remained completely absent from the conversation. Joe, for his part, made one thing very clear. He said that the most dangerous part of public controversy isn't misinformation, it's incomplete information paired with massive reach. He emphasized that when audiences are fed fragments, they build conclusions that can never be walked back. And he admitted something rare for him. that even he didn't feel comfortable speculating further without facts that weren't publicly available. That admission landed hard, because it confirmed what many viewers had already started to suspect. There were gaps in this story that no influencer, commentator, or podcaster could fill. Not responsibly. And those gaps were where the chaos lived. As days passed, the conversation didn't die down. It sharpened. People began asking different questions. Not who's lying, but who's benefiting from the confusion. Not who spoke, but who hasn't. The narrative shifted away from personalities and toward power, toward access, toward who controls stories once they are released into the wild. And through all of it, one truth became impossible to ignore. The interview didn't expose answers. It exposed fractures. Fractures in trust. Fractures in media responsibility. Fractures in how quickly commentary can turn into consequence. Joe Rogan didn't go nuclear by shouting. He did it by forcing a moment of reflection that no one was ready for. Candace Owens didn't implode on camera. She revealed the limits of what even a confident voice can safely carry alone. And the internet, for once, wasn't satisfied with picking sides. It wanted clarity. But clarity never came. What remained instead was tension. Unresolved. Lingering. The kind that suggests this story hasn't ended, only paused. Because when narratives stop abruptly, it's rarely because the truth has surfaced. It's usually because the next chapter hasn't been released yet. And whatever comes next will reshape everything people think they already know. Before you scroll, before the algorithm buries this, understand something clearly: stories like this don't just disappear. They pause. They regroup. And then they come back louder, darker, and far more revealing than before. If you felt unsettled watching this unfold, that's not an accident. If something in your gut told you this conversation crossed a line no one was prepared for, you're not alone. This wasn't just a viral drama. This was a fracture moment, the kind where silence becomes louder than statements and unanswered questions become the real story. And here's the uncomfortable truth: what happens next depends on who's still paying attention. When you like this video, you're not just boosting content, you're keeping this conversation alive in a space where people clearly want it buried. When you comment, you're adding your voice to a record that doesn't disappear when tweets get deleted and clips get taken down. And when you subscribe, you're making sure you're here when the next shift happens, because it always does. Don't underestimate how fast narratives change when the spotlight moves. Don't assume someone else will catch the next detail, the next contradiction, the next moment that cracks everything open. If you leave now, you risk missing the context that makes everything suddenly make sense. So speak up. Drop your thoughts below, even if they are messy, even if you're unsure. This isn't about being right. It's about staying aware. Hit like so this doesn't vanish into the feed. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when the next piece surfaces, and it will, you'll want to see it in real time, not rewritten after the fact. Stay watching. Stay questioning. Because silence only protects one side of the story, and this one is far from over.